talk?
Okay.
Otherwise, to talk. The subcommittee will come to order. Good afternoon and welcome to today's hearing entitled Missing from the Labor Force, Examining Declining Employment Among Working Age Men. I know this is a priority topic for the ranking member, Mr. Davis, and I appreciate his work on this issue. For decades, the focus of most of our government assistance programs has been mothers and children living in poverty. In these attempts to help single mothers with children, we have left out a key figure in the family, the father. Today, there are more than 7 million working-age men in America who are not working or looking for work. Unfortunately, this is not a new phenomenon. The large number of men not in the labor force is a trend which has been growing for the past 50 years. In 1967, 96% of men were working or looking for a job. Today, it's only 88%. And it is even worse for those men without a high school diploma, an alarming 83%, or 1 in 6 are out of work. While unemployment rates have been up and down over the past 5 decades, inactivity among working-age men, those ages 25 to 54, has only risen. As Derek Thompson noted in The Atlantic in late 2014, inactivity among men grew during the Carter, Reagan, Clinton, and both Bush administrations. It grew during the dot-com boom and during the Great Recession. And most concerning, inactivity among working-age men has grown more since the end of the Great Recession than it did during the Great Recession itself. This steady decline is most troubling because so few people seem to be discussing it. There has been great outrage or debate. There has not been great outrage or debate. It's barely even been a topic of discussion. Yet it has a profound impact on our society, the economy, and individual and family well-being. The U.S. ranks second to last in male labor force participation when it comes to other OECD nations, ahead of only Italy. American men who are not in the labor force report spending less than 1 hour a day working or looking for work. And it is not as if they are all of a sudden becoming the primary caretakers at home, as they are less likely than working men to be caring for household members such as children or aging parents. With a 4.4% unemployment rate combined with more than 6.2 million job openings, a historically high level as we continue to grow the economy, now is the time to engage these men and get them back in the workforce for the benefit of themselves as well as their families. But the economy is not the only major concern. This lack of work also has growing impacts on family structure and our society. Today, there are roughly 11 million fathers who do not live with their children in the United States. Close to 25% of them have no earnings and therefore are unable to support and care for their children. There are more than 600,000 sentenced prisoners nationwide released from prison each year, many struggling to find work and who frequently end up offending again, costing taxpayers and hurting communities. And there are more than 12 million adults who are able to work yet are receiving food stamps with no reported earnings, up from just 4 million in 2000, highlighting the growing dependence on our public benefit programs. In terms of child support alone, which this subcommittee has jurisdiction over, we should consider looking at ways to better connect non-working fathers to our already existing workforce development system and provide them with on-the-job training and apprenticeships when available. We also should be looking to make sure all of our benefit programs coordinate with the child support system so families are getting the help they need from the start. While there is no single cause of the declining work among men, there are a number of contributing factors: a lack of training and credential completion, the rising prevalence of criminal records, higher usage of opioids, and a growing dependency on public benefit programs. We know these men. They are our fathers and our sons, our uncles and nephews, and families all across this nation depend on them every day. I'm most excited to hear from Mr. Tyrone Ferens, who has turned his life around after a time of turmoil and is now working as an electrician at TEI Electrical Solutions. He began this work after attending an employer-led workforce development program known as Project Jumpstart. I'm grateful to him for sharing his story and helping our subcommittee gain a better picture of the issue at hand. Over this past year, the subcommittee has emphasized hearing from individuals with real firsthand experience with the issues we are grappling with and attempting to reform day in and day out, and I'm glad Mr. Ferens is here to give us his perspective today. We have a lot to learn, and I'm looking forward to diving in. With that, I recognize Ranking Member Davis for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing about the continuing decline in working-age men in the labor force. My heart breaks for the people in Texas and Louisiana struggling to recover from Hurricane Harvey, and I look forward to working with you on ways our subcommittee can help in the recovery as well. Although the decline of men in the labor force is partly due to demographic factors such as age and health, I see every day the structural barriers to work that face low-income men in Chicago, especially African-American men. In Chicago, the unemployment rate for African-American men was 21.7% in 2015, more than triple the national average. In 2014, nearly half of African-American men between age 20 and 24 in Chicago were disconnected from both school and work. The educational opportunity gap is startling in both urban and rural areas. In fact, we are hosting a large event in Chicago this weekend to focus in part about ways to overcome the structural barriers facing African American men. These men desperately want to work, but they face multiple barriers like low levels of education and basic skills, health and substance abuse problems, and mental health challenges by exposure to violence and trauma. Barriers that make work challenging and sometimes impossible. Many men also make mistakes and have made mistakes in the past, often due to addiction, and they paid for those mistakes. But when they return to their communities after incarceration, determined to do better, they encounter tremendous obstacles to employment. These men need a fair shot, not a scarlet letter. This hearing presents a chance for us to look for ways to help hard-working men and women climb the economic ladder and find good-paying jobs to support themselves and their families. The most powerful incentive to work is the opportunity to get a good job. The most effective work requirement is access to a job that lifts a worker and his or her family out of poverty. Good-paying jobs break the cycle of poverty and recidivism, lifting communities and the overall economy. To promote economic opportunity, we can strengthen access to education and training to ensure workers have the skills needed to secure good jobs and that they have the right skills to work in the changing economy. To promote economic opportunity, we can help fathers address the obstacles in their path. The Affordable Care Act increased access to health care that parents need to address mental, physical, and addiction health issues that can prevent work, and that's a good start. Newly revised rules for child support enforcement increased fathers' ability to provide financially for their children, but we could do far more to help those fathers work. Our federal fatherhood programs help fathers play positive roles in their families, but these grants reach only a small share of those who need them, and they should also enhance availability of job training. Further, we need to enact Family First Prevention Services Act, which would allow us to address family substance abuse challenges and support family members who step up to help instead of waiting until the only alternative is foster care. If we shift our policies to address the structural barriers and expand opportunities to supporting these individuals, families, and communities, we can help these men climb the ladder and secure meaningful career pathways to better support their kids and families. I look forward to working together to tackle these structural barriers and promote economic opportunities. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and yield back.
Thank you to our ranking member. I appreciate your statement. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the table. First, we have Mr. Brett Orell, Vice President for Family and Economic Stability at ICF International. Then second, we have Mr. Mike Henderson, President and CEO of the Associated Builders and Contractors of Baltimore. Then we have Mr. Tyrone Ferens, as we referenced earlier, a recent graduate of Project Jumpstart. And finally, we have Mr. Anthony Lowry, Director of Policy and Advocacy at the SAFER Foundation. Witnesses are reminded to limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. All of your written statements will be included in the record. You'll see the light indicator for green, yellow, and red. Fairly obvious. When you see that yellow light, you might look to bring the flight in for a safe landing. So we'll begin with Mr. Orell. You can begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Davis for inviting me here today. I'm here to
there you go.
Here to discuss a report that I co-authored with Dr. Harry Holzer at Georgetown University and Robert Dorr of the American Enterprise Institute on getting men back to work, solutions from the right and left. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for the excellent summary and introduction as to the problem. So I'm going to skip over the what's the problem and go talk about solutions instead. If we want to reverse this downward spiral that we're facing in terms of availability and willingness to participate in jobs, we need to look at 3 key areas, and I'd like to highlight those. First of all, building skills among men seeking work, incentivizing job creation, and then focusing on special populations, and I'll take those in order. To improve employment and wages among not in labor force males, it is vital to enhance skills in the form of post-secondary credentials, including certifications and associate degrees, using research-validated, sector-based strategies that focus on high-growth, high-wage occupations. This will require regionally focused, data-driven employment programs that align training with high-growth industries and occupations. Congress should provide guidance to the Departments of Education and Labor to expand sector-based strategies in secondary, post-secondary, technical training programs, and apprenticeships, and consider new strategies to apply these specifically to out-of-workforce males. Second, Congress should review laws governing existing public development finance instruments to expand employment opportunities for disengaged workers through the use of community benefit agreements, or CBAs. ICF has been working with Sagamore Associates in Baltimore, Maryland, to leverage a CBA associated with the passage of a recent $525 million tax increment financing package to create a robust, project-specific workforce development initiative. Sagamore has committed to setting aside for Baltimore residents 30% of the estimated 40,000 jobs this project will generate, and this commitment is backed by $40 million in developer-funded workforce development activities to find, train, and place Baltimore residents in construction and follow-on jobs. Third, we need to focus on special populations. Large numbers of men come into contact with government agencies through child support enforcement and the corrections and criminal justice system. Congress should take steps to strengthen workforce development aspects of both of these programs. In child support, we endorsed continued federal-state efforts to right-size child support orders and to develop debt forgiveness strategies that will encourage work rather than penalize it. We also believe more needs to be done to improve employment opportunities for non-custodial parents through innovative strategies like NCP Choices in Texas that combine a clear work, pay, play, or pay the consequences option with enhanced workforce development services. We also recommend that Congress increase incentives to states to pay for these enhanced services by strengthening the federal child support match for employment-related services. Finally, for incarcerated populations and those who have recently returned from prison, we have a key opportunity to increase engagement of men in work. Through the U.S. Department of Labor, Congress has invested in pre- and post-release programs that pave the way for post-incarceration employment. These projects focus on connecting returning citizens to faith and community-based groups that help manage reentry and connect clients to training and employment. A recent study funded by the Ford Foundation that the highest performing of these DOL grants had a number of common attributes. They all worked closely with the criminal justice system. They all created tailored reemployment plans, and they've all focused on helping clients gain industry-recognized credentials to boost post-release employment. The Council of State Governments is doing groundbreaking work in aligning recidivism, risk assessments with market-driven employability assessments in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I highly recommend taking a close look at that. These and other successful strategies should be sustained, evaluated, refined, and then replicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arell. Mr. Henderson, you may begin.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Henderson. I'm the president of Associated Builders and Contractors in Baltimore. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members, for your kind invitation to appear before this hearing today. So I'm here today to talk about a workforce development program we developed 11 years ago in Baltimore City called Project Jumpstart. I'm joined by Mr. Tyrone Ferens. He's a journeyman electrician, and he's one of our STAR graduates. Project Jumpstart is an 89-hour pre-apprenticeship and job placement program. We run 6 classes every year, 3 on the east side of town and 3 on the west side. We have an 80% graduation rate, and we graduate approximately 120 students every year. But far more important than our graduation rate is our job placement rate. Because at the end of the day, the only true measuring stick that really matters with a workforce development program is this: are people getting jobs? And not just jobs, but jobs that have progressive salaries, jobs that provide recognized, accredited training, and the opportunities to grow in their profession and in their careers. In our case, our job placement rate is 75%, and that's an average over the 11 years. But in just the last couple years, that placement rate is better than 80%. Our program is primarily funded through private foundations like the Andy Casey Foundation and the Weinberg Foundation. But over the last few years, we also are getting funding through the City of Baltimore and the State of Maryland. For the purposes of this hearing, my goal is to share with this committee some of the invaluable lessons that we've learned over the last 11 years on those elements that help make a program like ours successful. And hopefully once I give you some background and some context about the program and our students, it will better explain why we are asked to be here today. So to begin with, our students are all Baltimore City residents. 75% are ex-offenders. Nearly half of our graduates are over the age of 35. Many of our best success stories, including that of the gentleman seated next to me, involves graduates over the age of 40. Over the past couple years, there's been a strong push by our public and private funders to focus more on the 18 to 24-year-old population, a group that traditionally we have not done as well with. After the riots in Baltimore in the spring of 2015, we decided to bring in 20 to 25 of our best graduates, and we held a focus group. One of the questions we asked them was, why were you able to succeed when the guy who sat next to you in class or the guy who grew up across the street from you did not? And to a person, they said they saw Project Jumpstart really as their best last chance to succeed in this life. And if they didn't stick with it, if they didn't apply themselves fully to it, in 6 months' time, they'd be back in prison or they'd be dead. That wisdom and that sense of urgency is something we've seen in droves from our older students, individuals who made a mistake earlier in life and are now looking for an opportunity to right that ship. Unfortunately, you don't get that kind of a life perspective without making mistakes and taking your lumps. A year ago, Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Hospital wanted to meet with us to try to figure out why Jumpstart works. Between those two entities, they spend over $100 million a year in construction, and part of Baltimore City's programs where they encourage local hiring, they work with a variety of workforce development programs. And they said when they work with other programs, sometimes it takes 20 candidates before one placement actually sticks. With us, we send them 4, and 2 or 3 of those people actually get jobs. I can only speak to the population we work with every day, but the problem in Baltimore City is not that you have men who don't want to work, but you have men who don't know the path to get a good job. They don't have the connections with those who are making those hiring decisions. No one ever taught them how to build a network or how to make those connections. So one of the most important things we learned is you've got to be part of a community, employer community. ABC Baltimore represents nearly 650 commercial builders in our region, and we represent more builders and employers than anyone else in our area. There's a lot of well-meaning work development programs out there, but they're disconnected from the employment community. So the employers have got to be central to your program. And I can see I'm running out of time, so.
3 seconds. Thank you. We'll have time for some questions and dialogue after as well. Mr. Ferens, you may begin.
Thank you for having me here today. Mr. Davis, the beginning of your statement sounded like you were describing me to a T. I was raised in a single-parent home. My father was an addict and a drug dealer in Brooklyn. He still is to this day. I saw him only on the weekends, maybe once a month, and yet my 2 older brothers and myself followed him down that path exactly. We all have felony convictions. We've all spent time in jail. We've been through rehabs. I personally spent 16 years in the grips of a crack and heroin addiction prior to coming to Jumpstart. My last conviction was a felony assault, and part of my sentence was a year of inpatient rehab. It was during that time I kind of came to grips with the fact that I was never going to amount to anything, but I did leave with a single goal, and that was to see that my son didn't have to go through the same path I did. And in order to do that, I was going to need to get a job, and I was going to need to stay out of prison. I went to a career center in Baltimore, and they referred me to Project Jumpstart. They were offering a $50 stipend to attend those classes, and that was enough for me to be interested in it. It was during the orientation I received a glimpse of hope for a better future, something I hadn't had. You know, during my addiction, plenty of occasions I didn't want to wake up in the morning. I didn't care if I lived or died. I didn't see any way, any route to a better future. During that 13 weeks of training, we received training in everything as far as math to residential wiring. We had resume preparation, mock interviews. We did conflict resolution. We did an OSHA 10-hour class. They seem to have had everything that we would need to be prepared to be successful in the workplace. We were taught what employers were expecting from us, how to be successful on a job site with the different demographics and the different people from different ethnicities and different races and religion on a job site is something that I hadn't been exposed to before. In the beginning, they explained to me that if I graduated at the top of my class, that they could pretty much guarantee me a job. I graduated at the top of my class. 2 weeks later, I was placed on a job. They were able to get me hired, even though I had an 8-year gap in my resume. 4 years after that, well, actually 6 years, I completed my 8,000 hours of on-the-job training, 4 years of apprenticeship classes with ABC, and today I'm a licensed journeyman, as Mike said. The biggest impact that this program has had on my life is it goes far beyond me. My son is the first one to step foot on a college campus. My mother had retired and was struggling on Social Security. And after years of torment that I put her through as an addict, I was able to move her into my home. I became a first-time homeowner last year. My daughter, who's 30 years old, spent half of her life with a father that was an addict and a disgrace and an embarrassment. She is presently in the Jumpstart class that's taking place now. She looks up to me, she admires me, and she wants to follow in my footprints. It's 3 generations of my family that's been changed from this program. I mentor now younger Jumpstart clients. throughout this entire process, I graduated 9 years ago. 9 years ago, Jumpstart has been there supporting me every step of the way. I mean, my problems have evolved. In the beginning, it was court dates and probation hearings and charges, pending charges. You know, now I call the director in regards to parenting skills because I didn't have a father. I struggle in that area, you know, and she always reminds me that look at how far you've came because your problems are the same problems regular people have now. We call them regular people problems. You know, she explained to me that everyone has problems in relationships and with their spouses and with their children. So I'm grateful for that as well. It's just a genuine gift to have this program in my life. And I get questions all the time about is there one like it in my state? You know, I get calls from my family members and things like that. And unfortunately, I have to say no. But I would like to see this committee just do something in this field to help. But thank you for having me today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Mr. Lowry.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the decline in the labor force participation of men. I represent Safer Foundation, a Chicago-based nonprofit that has provided employment and support services for people with criminal records over the past 4 decades. The Safer Foundation believes that men and women who've made mistakes in the past should have an opportunity to be self-sufficient so that they can take care of their families and make our community safer. There is dignity in work. Our clients come to us because they want to work, are willing to do everything in their power to earn the right to work. But our society's overemphasis on punishment at the expense of rehabilitation is affecting labor force participation rates and workforce morale. My interaction with directly impacted individuals has taught me that hopelessness rather than choice keeps people out of work. I have seen many very qualified people who've had criminal records be denied employment, housing, or license decades after they've served their time. The issue of criminal justice reform is a socioeconomic one. Our country cannot afford to continue to deprive returning individuals of a second chance to become contributing members of our communities. Instead of shunning them, it is imperative that we begin to view their reintegration as vital to our country's prosperity. We have been good at filling prisons but sluggish in fostering reintegration and economic inclusion, an important ingredient of public safety. Our National Employment Law Project, one of our national partners, estimates that 1 in 3 Americans have some type of arrest or conviction record that will interfere with their ability to get a job. Nearly half of U.S. children have a parent with a criminal record. As a result, our agencies, our taxpayers are burdened by a preventable problem. Take the example of Illinois, where according to one estimate, 42% of working age adults have an arrest or conviction record, and where almost half of the 30,000 people released from Illinois Department of Corrections will return to it within 3 years of release. The Illinois Sentencing Policy Advisory Council estimates that recidivism amongst probationers and parolees and the formerly incarcerated cost the state of Illinois $16 billion over a 5-year period. Mass incarceration and employment barriers faced by people with criminal records combined with the opioid epidemic have deflated the U.S. labor force participation rates, which are as low today as they were over 30 years ago. This has a tremendous negative impact on our economy. The U.S. is experiencing a long period of economic expansion, but experts warn that this expansion will end prematurely if we don't relieve these structural strains on the labor force participation. Safer Foundation has worked with people with arrest and conviction records again for over 40 years. Research and Safer's experience has shown that employment is the most direct link to reduce recidivism. I go into prisons, I go into schools, I go into churches, and the biggest question I ask people when I go into a correctional facility is, what are you going to do to stay free? Dignity, understanding, and viability are dependent on their ability to get a job. A federal commitment to create more job opportunities and skills training will reduce the attendance strain on our criminal justice system and on taxpayers. It will increase the tax base, give employers credentialed employees, stabilize violence communities, and pull families out of intergeneration cycles of poverty and violence. As the labor market tightens, employers are more ready than ever to give people with records a fair shot. SAFER has partnered with hundreds of employers to meet their workforce needs. Our newest initiative is our SAFER Demand Skill Collaborative, which came out of our clients' desire for living wage jobs and economic mobilities in some high-growth industries like healthcare. As a result of our participation in healthcare, and when we started with our healthcare initiative, I think I was here a few years ago testifying and just looking at opportunities in high-growth industries, and we picked healthcare. We also partnered with Johns Hopkins Hospital, who have been hiring people with criminal records for over the past 15 years. We partnered with Hopkins. Now we have a consortium in Chicago with over 12 healthcare hospitals and networks, where out of the first 60 people we've got hired in healthcare, only one person has left that job. So again, what we feel that this body, that the federal government can do, is provide incentives to contractors, pass legislation modeled after laws in Michigan, Ohio, and Texas that provide negligent liability protection for employers who hire people with criminal records. We feel that will be an important pathway to employment and increasing opportunity in the workforce.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate each of your testimony. It's refreshing to see a focus on solutions. It's really easy to identify a problem around this place. It's more difficult to focus on solutions. And certainly, as you speak from experience, it's important that you share your perspective. And Mr. Ferens, I can't thank you enough for sharing in a very direct way, helpful for us, and certainly salute you. And I would say I look up to you as well for really making a difference in your life and allowing others to help with that. And so that the fact that we see this problem here, where I hear from employers all the time they need employees, and I think we have a large number of people who would like to leave poverty and through economic opportunity. And so whenever we can fill those gaps, I think we are more productive. And certainly Jumpstart is important, especially as it impacts families. And so I'm just wondering real briefly, Mr. Ferens, if you could identify perhaps, if you could go back in time, what would have been something you would have changed perhaps to help you achieve success perhaps earlier in life?
Yeah, I thought about that in the past, and I struggled in school. I was diagnosed with dyslexia like in high school. I have adult ADHD that I've just been diagnosed with. Academics wasn't a strong suit for me, but hands-on learning works for me. Visual learning works for me. Being that there was such an emphasis on going to college and I was struggling in school, I didn't see that as my route. I tried athletes, my genetics failed me there. I wasn't given too many other options. So had I been exposed to tradesmen and, knowing that you could make six figures, close to six figures as an electrician, and that was another route to live a successful, productive life, I would have probably chose it way earlier in life. It's just the exposure to other things, to other routes.
So you discovered Jumpstart through a career center and a stipend associated?
Yes. I went to a career center just trying to get anything. I really thought I'd be working at McDonald's for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. That ban the box thing is high on my agenda because it's, people don't come out of prison wanting to go back to prison. It's a lack of opportunities and out of desperation that you go back to doing the things that you're accustomed to doing. Even now, 10 years in, there's jobs I can't get there as far as placements and facilities because of my conviction. I tried to move into a nicer neighborhood and a better school district for my son, and I'm qualified financially, but because I had to put convicted of a felony, I was denied. So it's a huge obstacle.
For about 10 years, you're saying?
My last conviction was in 2007.
Mr. Henderson, if you could elaborate a little more on Jumpstart and how you, what led to the creation and then also deploying that and how you think that has been most effective in impacting the community How long has it been around now?
So
If you could turn on your mic.
I was so impressed that you thought to push the button before you talk. 11 years ago, Johns Hopkins was getting ready to spend $1 billion something to create a biotech community in their footprint of the hospital, and so they wanted to make sure that people who lived in that community benefited economically. So we responded to a RFP. We were selected, and we made mistakes in the beginning. In the beginning, we tended to side towards leniency, and we realized that we were not producing candidates that employers wanted. They did great for a couple weeks, and then they flame out. So very quickly, we learned you train the way you work and high standards, and it's not for everybody. And that's kind of an anathema to a lot of city politicians, that it's not for everybody. But we maintained very high standards to get in, high standards to stay in, and high standards, a lot of times, and Tyrone could tell you this, that first placement isn't always the best placement. And we have a full-time placement director, and she says, do it, work hard, listen, show interest. I'm going to find you a better placement. But it was kind of his proving ground, yes? And so high standards, and it's so important that you're connected to employers. Everything we do is centered around what employers are looking for. One of the most effective things we do is we bring people like Tyrone back, and they talk to kids in class. Kids, these are not kids. Talk to students in class, because at some point, they've all been through a program. And when they first got in the Jump Start, they thought, well, this is just another program that somebody sent me to, maybe my probation officer. And they found out very early Jump Start is different, because we've been able to build a team of people who are very serious about helping them succeed. Is that pretty much what you're looking for?
Appreciate that. Any other comments others would like to offer? Mr. Lowry?
Well, first of all, I would like to commend Tyrone on his journey. Also, being a person with a past criminal record is one of the greatest challenges a person will ever face. As far as having the anxiety, letting your family down, letting yourself down, then trying to re-enter the workforce. Today, I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at SAFER, recognized as a national advocate. In Illinois, I initiated the ban-the-box legislation, occupational licensing legislation, the ceiling legislation. But let me go and apply for a job. A 20-year-old criminal record would determine what the employer felt I was. So I always talk to our people with every class that comes into our building, and we see about 5,000 or 6,000 people a year. As far as what we're trying to do is create a new image of who you are in the eyes of the employer. And just talking to our people about the impact of the record so they can explain to their families. Because again, when you see a lot of situations of people having the record and have promised that they're going to do the right thing and don't get the opportunity, as Tyrone said, then they go back to the old streets, the old things that they used to do, and they wind up incarcerated again.
You spoke briefly about legal liability, addressing that. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. What we had to do, in the state of Illinois, we, about 18 years ago, we passed legislation, what we call a certificate of good conduct, which provides when the court looks at a person's rehabilitation, the court declares that person rehabilitated. And with that certificate of good conduct contains negligent liability protection. As far as doing this for the years I've been doing it, the biggest concern from employers were if I hire a person with a record and they do something on the job, I can get sued. So the negligent liability was critically important. And doing the healthcare work, we were surprised when we went to Ohio, when we went to Texas, that they had negligent liability legislation on the books to kind of erase that fear that employers have so that they can look at the candidate, they can look past the fear. So what we're doing in Illinois is pushing forward negligent liability protection for all employers who hire people with criminal records, because that will eliminate that fear so they can get good people. so that people can get that job, transform themselves, their families, and then ultimately the communities in which most people in Illinois with criminal records live in.
Maybe there could be some negative or some negligent liability protection for Congress passing bad bills from time to time.
Yeah, that might help.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lowry, given the fact that I live in Chicago and the fact that SAFER is based in Chicago, I'm aware of the long history of engagement in this type of work. What has fascinated me the most has been the relationship developed with Johns Hopkins University Medical Center. Could you share a little bit more how you made that contact and how you decided that you would pursue the health industry as an area to explore?
Okay, thank you, Congressman. And again, I'd like to thank you for your part as far as making all of that possible. I was invited here a couple years ago at a Father's Day event, and I think with the featured Attorney General Holder. And in doing research for that event, I saw the staggering number of 15 million jobs in healthcare. And I was like, this is unbelievable. Cabrini Green Legal Aid, which is the leading criminal records advocate in the state of Illinois, had called me about a lady who had a 30-year-old misdemeanor conviction and couldn't get a job as a CNA in a healthcare facility. And I said, this is un-American. So when I came here and talked about the need for people, for congressional members to go back to their communities, talk to healthcare entities, because healthcare is the largest employer, fastest growing sector in this country. Congressman Davis does a workshop at the Legislative Annual Caucus, and he featured Pamela Park from Johns Hopkins Hospital, who was the head of human resources at the time. When we heard Pamela talk about how she had been hiring, Hopkins had been hiring people with criminal records for the past 15 years, we said, well, wait a minute, we need to do this in Chicago. So we invited Hopkins to come to Chicago, and Pamela was so gracious to come. Congressman Davis came in, joined the event. We got the Chicago Urban League, Cook County Board of Commissioners, and we had the first healthcare forum in the city of Chicago where we brought hospital CEOs, hiring managers, to talk about an untapped workforce. We highlighted one of our former clients, Melody Young, who as a young mother addicted to drugs, had went to prison, came out, got a job in healthcare, but when the background check came back, she was let go. She continued to go to school, work on her clemency and pardon. Now she's a nurse with Great Lakes Naval for the Veterans Administration. So when Melody told her story and her journey about redemption and challenges and opportunity, saying that I'm not a bad person, I made bad choices, she changed the face of who healthcare employers thought people with criminal records were. That allowed us to have the opportunity and opening up hiring opportunities. So news came to Washington about what we had did, and our national partner, National Employment Law Project, collaborated with us. So we did additional forums in Dallas, in Cleveland, and in Oakland, California. Now we have healthcare employers as part of our consortium sending us open positions. What we've done is change that image and open up that opportunity. The opportunities, when we were in Texas, the lady who heads the consortium in Dallas said, all the graduates in all the medical schools in Texas, we still do not have enough people to fill these positions. So we're looking at healthcare being a natural, and then just eliminating that barrier, getting those to see that people make mistakes, they're credentialed, there's protection. Can we just have a basic American opportunity to work?
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ferens, listening to you was kind of like being in a Church of God in Christ church and manna coming down from heaven. To be very honest about it, your experience, your success really makes you a role model for individuals who've had similar circumstances. If you pinpointed one barrier, what would you say was the most difficult challenge to get beyond?
You said pinpoint one. I think the most difficult part for me, it wasn't even so much the training. It was cutting loose of people and things that I was accustomed to, the people that surrounded me. When I decided I wanted to change my life and I was attending this program, I still lived in the community that I used to get high in. I still lived in the community that I sold drugs in. So I think breaking those relationships and stepping out, being strong enough to say, I'm not going back that route, was probably the most difficult part of that change.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. This is a really timely subject, and I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. I grew up in Selma, Alabama, and I have the opportunity now to represent Birmingham and Selma and here in Congress. But I can tell you that the difference between Birmingham and the rural communities is vast. Yet I represent both. So my first question is, how do we take programs like Jumpstart, programs like Safer Foundation, and scale them to smaller communities, rural communities? I know, Mr. Chairman, you and I both are very passionate about rural communities and the systemic barriers to employment there's systemic barriers and there's structural barriers, but in rural communities, it's lack of transportation, it's lack of skills, obviously, but also lack of economic opportunity. So as we see people graduating from these rural communities, they're not coming back, and they're becoming smaller and smaller. And this nation was founded on small communities. And so I don't want to lose that. So my question to both you, Mr. Lowry, and you, Mr. Henderson, is how do we scale your kind of programs to small rural communities?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't have rural communities. We have suburbia. And I don't think that counts.
It doesn't count.
What drives these programs are, our program is driven by economic activity. There is a severe shortage of skilled workers in the construction industry nationwide. But we're at the epicenter where the Sagamores of the world and Johns Hopkins of the world are spending hundreds of millions of dollars annually. How that translates into wow, I don't know. I wish I had some long way of saying
Lowry?
I can't help. I don't know.
Well, what our experience has shown, and then we also operate two work release centers for the Illinois Department of Corrections, where we do the training and we look at the areas of high employer need. Because again, to eliminate the stigma of hiring a person with records, the need has to be tremendous. So we collaborated, and we had a program a few years ago where we had job training, computer training in every state prison in the state of Illinois, all 27. And we collaborated with community colleges to do the training in those
That's
areas.
a very good point. My time is almost up, and I really want to commend Mr. Farron. I want, you really are the face of what's possible if you want to change your life and you have the resources and the opportunity to do so and the will to do so. So I want to commend you for that. Unemployment in my district, the average unemployment in my district is 9%, even though the national average is 4%, so it's almost double. And we have a job fair every year. We alternate urban-rural because I have both in my district. The first one we had was in Birmingham, and it drew over 5,000 people. People were wrapped around in a very hot August day around the Civic Center, showing to many of the folks who think that people don't want to work, that they do want to work. People do want to work. I think that there's a indomitable spirit, and that's nothing is more important than the dignity of knowing that you can take care of yourself and your family. And so my next question, or last question, really is to you, Mr. Farron. One doesn't walk this road alone. Were there any federal programs that were wraparound services that helped you while you were being trained through Jumpstart?
None that I was aware of. Yeah, there was none that I was aware of.
If you could sort of have a magic wand and sort of help all of us understand second chances. What would you say to those who don't believe that people should deserve second chances?
I can tell you Jumpstart graduates, I can speak from my perspective.
Yes.
And on the job, we operate at a whole nother level. I mean, the level of gratitude we have for someone giving us the opportunity to perform, there's no reason for you to hire me. So when you give me a job, you know, Jumpstart graduates are genuinely grateful. We had a MICA job that was behind, it's a school, education, they opened 7 days a week for us to work. My company has over 100 employees. There was probably 17 that showed up 7 days a week for 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. 9 of the 14 of the 17 were Jumpstart graduates. My company only has 14 Jumpstart graduates on its staff. You know, it was a chance for us to show our commitment to our company and thank them for
and to
hiring.
your community. Yep, thank you. Well, I commend you and thank you for being here today, all of you.
Thank you. Ms. Walorski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm all fired up listening to your story because it is, I think, the answer and the solution we're looking for. And I kind of want to address this to you, Mr. Orrell, just kind of like the bird's eye view of just a couple of things. One was you talked about in your written testimony, Mr. Orrell, about the need for a consistent message about the social, economic, and personal importance of work and its self-efficiency. You trace it back to the '96 Welfare Reform Act, and I want to go a little bit further than that. In 1935 State of the Union address, President Franklin Roosevelt said, "Work must be found for able-bodied but destitute workers." Posters for his Works Progress Administration blared in big letters all over the country. Work promotes confidence. And I want to get to you as also, Mr. Ferens, after I ask you these questions. And I know the how is different in today's culture, but FDR is also a big believer in the idea that those things that can work must work, and that we must discourage sitting on the sidelines. So in my district, in northern Indiana, in the home of the RV industry, today, right now, in just one county, we have 30,000 jobs available. We're at full employment because of about 1.7% unemployment, meaning 1.7 of the people are not going to work. 30,000 jobs today. There are plenty of reasons for this. I hear it every day from everybody and their brother. They can't hire workers that pass the drug test. And this is in relation to just this latest onslaught of opioid addiction. So, you know, we've looked at this at several layers in my state. The governor, you know, we're engaged now with the task force, drug czar in my state at the federal level as well, looking at our state of Indiana. These opioid deaths now are being called deaths of despair, but there's still tens of thousands of jobs available. And I guess, Mr. Orrell, from the big picture, can you give us some perspective on the relationship between unemployment and the rapid rise of opioid addiction in our country? And then does anybody have any conclusive evidence to determine, is this a causal relationship? And then followed up by, if so, does unemployment lead to addiction, or is it vice versa?
So it's a complex interplay of factors. I highly recommend the study by Ann Case out of Princeton University on this, she and her husband coined this phrase, the deaths of despair, because she really looked at, after you tease out all the factors that could contribute to the opioid addiction, what you get is a cumulative impact on people's lives that is founded in unemployment. It's not only unemployment, right. It's breakdown of families, it's the dissolution of other community institutions, it's problems in marriage, it's all sorts of things that feed into it. But after you've controlled for all of that, you don't really see the rise in the kind of deaths of despair that we've seen until you see the deindustrialization of the American economy and the loss of those jobs. Unemployment, they argue, is really at the base of this.
And I guess, Mr. Ferens, thanks also for your story. But I guess, you know, you've walked through this world, maybe not just with opioids, but certainly drug addiction. And so for you, you know, you've already said kind of how you got turned into and got turned around into something else when you changed your mind. But as you kind of look out over the scale of the map today, do you think it's also the same kind of, is it an unemployment issue that turns your head around to say, I need to be responsible. I can do this. I'm thinking of the people in Indiana right now, 30,000 jobs. And technically, people still talking about there's no jobs, there's no good jobs. Do you have a perspective on that?
It's hard for me to fathom that situation.
Oh, I know.
You know, from the inner city, it's always a lack of opportunities. But I know in my walk, drug use starts earlier in life than unemployment, before you even start looking for a job. You know, so I would probably go with the drug use leads to unemployment, just from my perspective in the inner city. And a lot of it is, you know, the single-parent homes and the, I guess you would call it depression. It's, you know, it's hard to look your kid, well, as a father. You have single-parent homes because fathers you don't want to be reminded of your failure. It's hard when you can't put sneakers on your kid's feet to be in that kid's life. You know, it's much easier to turn and run because you're unemployed rather than stay in that kid's life and feel like a complete failure. You know, so I would just, it's a big picture, you know, and you turn to drugs to deal with feeling like a failure. You turn, it's far more bigger than what I can offer you.
No, I appreciate your perspective, and thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here and sharing your time and your testimony. Mr. Orrell, I was wondering, much of the success of a program like this has to do with changing the culture in our country of basing success on who can send their kid to a four-year or to a college to further their career. How do we deal with that? How do we go from a society that puts so much emphasis on college, only to come out on the other side with huge debt and no job? How do we transition to a position where we actually encourage folks to use their talents that they have today and transition right into the workforce? What's the messaging that, what can government do to encourage that kind of mindset?
I think it's a great question as to how we encourage young people to think about non-four-year opportunities. The reality is that everybody in the economy now and in the future is going to need some sort of post-secondary training. And what we need to do is make young people aware of the opportunities. There are good livings to be had in the trades, in technical fields, in manufacturing, in healthcare, that don't require four-year degrees. So encouraging people, encouraging youth to understand, providing the information, here's what's available to you. Did you know it's not uncommon these days for welders to make $100,000 a year? Did you know that there are manufacturing jobs that will start you out at $40,000, $45,000 a year and with great career pathways? And you won't have to have the $80,000 in debt that you get out of a bachelor's degree for something you may not be able to use.
Interesting. It's a conundrum that we want to put emphasis on higher education, but at the same time, there are some folks that just do better, as Mr. Farron's indicated, outside of school, hands-on, and that's the kind of thing that public policy should support and not look down upon. I wondered if Mr. Henderson, you might be able to comment on whether or not you think that the groups, the projects like you've been working on, Project Jumpstart, government, community colleges, talk to each other. Do we talk outcomes-based to suggest how we can best work together? And if not, how can we encourage that by way of public policy?
It's a challenge. We work with the community colleges. We work with public schools. Everybody has their own fiefdom. Everyone has their own set of objectives they have to meet. And sometimes they feel like in order to get it, in order to get funding, they've got to do it unilaterally and when it makes sense to bring other people into the program. So, and I especially see this with the community colleges. They're an important partner for us, but they have their own dealing with funding, dealing with changing student body. I just want to tag on real quickly what the gentleman was saying about school. Change the way you incentivize and judge and hold principals and guidance counselors accountable. give accredited, industry-recognized training the same weight that they give AP tests and four-year college degrees, and you'll see a change.
Very, very solid recommendation. Thank you, sir. Mr. Ferens, your testimony, your story is really quite inspiring and compelling. I'm wondering if you might be able to tell me, you drew my interest with regard to criminal conviction. Mr. Lowry also spoke on the subject, and how that is an impediment to your future. Has there been any effort afoot to try and create an expungement process so that you can expunge your record and not have to go through life with that anchor on around your neck?
I have attempted in the past. There was a lot of bureaucracy as far as regards to your last offense being a conviction, whether it can be expunged or not. It just got extremely frustrating for me, you know, and it bothers me because I feel as though my son and my children are still paying for that mistake. Right. In regards to the opportunities that I have that would affect their lives and our living situation.
The purpose of expungement, and the reason why I raise it, is because it's supposed to give people like you who have proven themselves to society, who are not likely to be a recidivist, who are productive members of society, a second chance. And I've always supported, and I think it makes sense to support public policy that encourages that kind of fatherhood and citizenship going forward. So I appreciate your testimony, and I think it sheds light on an important need in public policy in this country.
And I just wanted to jump in for a second as far as in Illinois, we just passed the largest expansion of sealing in the history of the country, where before you had only 9 felony convictions that can be sealed. Now there are hundreds that can be sealed after the waiting period, after the appropriate rehabilitation. I think the biggest change that needs to happen, and I know Congressman Davis had introduced federal legislation about sealing the record, but the biggest thing is the perception of who a person with a criminal record is. And again, rehabilitation is not a made-up word. People turn their lives around. Given the opportunity to turn their lives around, the basic dignity of work, there has to be a commitment and a messaging from the federal government to allow people second chances to just basically work. And I think that'll go a long way with resolving issues, labor place, and all the other associated ills that we're facing.
Thank you, Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for the input. And I want to focus my opportunity here to really get beyond the data, and I spent a lot of time measuring the data, looking at it from an evidence-based perspective, but to have a conversation with you, Mr. Ferens, and primarily about the human experience that you went through. I, too, am the son of a single mother. Father passed when I was 2. I got 11 older brothers and sisters, and I was inspired by her to lead the life that I've led in order to sit here as a member of Congress, relatively coming from nothing. And so I'm interested in getting to sometimes of a debate that we have here in Washington, D.C., that I really try to look at it from the perspective of the other side of the aisle. When it comes to the conversation about work requirements, when it comes to the policies that we're trying to advocate for purposes of giving people the opportunity to get an education, volunteer in their community, to go to school, to get that work. And sometimes I'm chastised for advocating for that type of policy, that I'm heartless, that I'm clueless, that I don't know the difficulty that represents in a human being's life as they go through that requirement. And so sometimes I also have a conversation about the unintended consequences of what are good faith initiatives by many people here in Washington, D.C., when it comes to providing cash welfare or government assistance. And I don't think there's anyone here who is fundamentally opposed to that, but I want to understand the human psyche because we experienced it in our family when we relied on government programs. Is there any consequence to you as a human being when you are given a government program, a government check, as opposed to earning that government check or earning that resource that you bring to your family? Did you ever experience any of that in your life experience? And And could you share with me that story?
Yes, I've been a recipient of welfare, food stamps, a lot of government-assisted programs, and there's no comparison, none whatsoever. It's innate that as a man, you want to be the provider, the protector of your home. You know, you can't describe what it is to earn something in regards to just be given something. You know, I would have much preferred someone giving me or exposed me to a program like Jumpstart rather than me getting a check on the 3rd. You know, there's no pride that comes in that. There's no appreciation for it. There's no value in it. Anything that comes easy and, you know, you don't appreciate. So I wouldn't compare the two.
I appreciate that experience because that's exactly what I've heard as I've traveled around the country when we've taken an initiative on welfare reform. The dignity, the pride of earning that resource, even if it's a government program, that you're showing up and you're volunteering in your community, you're giving back to that community. I've seen such dignity as a result of that. Would you, Mr. Lowry or Mr. Farron, would you agree that sometimes what we do with the well-intentioned purpose of what we're trying to do may have an unintended consequence that gets to the psyche, the dignity, and the ability of an individual then, therefore, to achieve success because they've lost that dignity, they've lost that pride, they've lost that innate experience that Mr. Farron just testified to?
I think what we really have to understand is that government assistance is not a career pathway. In the state of Illinois, I think a person is entitled to a link card for food assistance. I think that's only $140 a month. So the fallacy of a person is depending on $140.
Well, Mr. Lowry, I'm not talking about dependency on that $140. I'm talking about the dignity that is associated with receiving that food, that link card for nothing in return for it. What Mr. Farron just testified to is a human experience that I think we should advocate for here in Washington, which says even at the $150, just the simple request of having an individual volunteer in their community to earn that card gives that person dignity, which then when they stand in front of their children, when they stand in front of their wives or their spouses or their husbands, they say, you know what, I've given something in return, I earned it. To me, that is a fundamental policy shift that we need to respect. And this isn't about dependency. This isn't about having a discussion about what is the level of resource to give. We can have that discussion all day long. It's about a fundamental policy that rewards the dignity of work, the pride that comes with it, and not destroying the human psyche, even though we are very well intentioned with the purposes and the programs of which we're advocating for.
I think, again, the biggest thing, and I don't have time to share my experiences as far as being a person with a record, the denial of opportunity, even with a college degree, having been a director of the highest rated public housing drug elimination program in the country, I lost that job. I had to work that earned fair job to get that assistance. From a college degree with a staff of 75 and a budget of $5 million, I was chopping jerk chicken and vegetable in a Jamaican restaurant just to fulfill that work requirement. But again, what we have to understand is people want to work because
totally agree with that.
That support, there is dignity in work. And when I go into facilities,
my time is expired.
The biggest challenge that people, can I get a job? Can I get a job? Can I get a job? So I think if the government can kind of be a drum major as far as second chances, encouraging employers with incentives, with negligent liability to give people an opportunity to work, because as the gentleman said, out of his program, the people who worked 7 days a week were the people who had records, who had a loyalty, a commitment, who honored that second chance. I think we're hurting ourselves by denying people that second chance because you have a workforce of millions of people around this country.
I appreciate it, Mr. Lyon. My time's expired. Mr. Farron, thank you for that human experience and your success.
Thank you. Mr. Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here, and Mr. Farron's congratulations on your life and your success. We all have challenges that we go through. I come from a family that struggled as we were growing up, ran away from home, lived in the street, lived in an old car. When I was 16 years old, some stories, mine's bad enough, domestic violence, that kind of stuff, but everybody has a cross to bear, and we all go through struggles, some a lot worse than others. but we all deserve second chances. That's what the Almighty God who created us tells us, right? We're all forgiven and deserve a second chance, and I strongly believe that myself. When you look at these reasons as to why there's unemployment, I just looked down the list here. If I can read them off very quickly, and I hope I can get through some of this stuff and get to my question. Number one, lack of post-secondary education and training resulting in lower wages, growing dependency on public benefit programs, high levels of opioid dependency and drug abuse, rising prevalence of criminal records along with unmet child support orders, absence of available jobs in many depressed communities, weakening of social or cultural norms that expect able-bodied men to work, and the list goes on and on and on. You guys have a big job, but your experiences that you just shared with us are the reason why some of these programs are successful. God makes us go through these challenges, right, to help those that are about to go through the same challenges go down a different path. And thank you, gentlemen, for doing that. I work with a group back in Seattle called DADS. It's Divine Alternatives for Dad Services. And Marvin and Jeanette are the husband and wife who co-founded this organization, and they're personal friends of mine. Marvin won't be ashamed, and Jeanette won't be ashamed for me to share with you that Marvin was a pimp and Jeanette was a prostitute. I was a longtime law enforcement officer, 33 years, and worked the Green River serial murder case and worked with those people on the street for 19 years, day in and day out. These people I call my friends. They have turned their life around, and they are helping men be fathers and get jobs. So as I listen to the comments from our witnesses today, it makes me think about the consequences for families and children, for the United States, of working-age men not participating in the workforce. It's a huge consequence for our whole society. For these men, the possibility of being unable to financially support a family, as you mentioned, or contribute to the upbringing of their children has a negative ripple effect on the entire country. And sometimes what I get frustrated in my law enforcement career, frustrated with, is that working with community, and Marvin and Jeanette have done a wonderful job of bringing in the faith-based community, which you know they're excited about helping, right? And bringing other social services surrounding. You get the families involved if you can. I have 2 adopted grandchildren, drug-addicted babies that are now 14 and 15 years old. They were 3 months old when my daughter adopted them. They have a wonderful life ahead of them. But I find that these organizations don't work together. They're disjointed, they're inefficient, they're struggling and fighting over the same dollars. And we need to invest in those programs that can come together, work together, right, and recognize the goal for all of us and not compete against the same dollars that another effort is competing for. So for all of you, I think all of you are coming from the same place and wanting to help as we are here on this panel. What is the one thing? For me, it goes back to family, to responsibility, accountability, and faith, to be honest with you. What is the one specific policy, though, that you could all point to that would be the one thing you think that we could do to help you do, accomplish the tremendous task that you're all involved in, right? Is there the one thing that just kind of pops in your mind? The one thing that maybe worked in your life, Mr. Ferenc, or maybe it was Jumpstart, maybe, I don't know. It can't be just money. What is it?
Just real quickly, we've seen it in our program. It's that role model. I grew up in a house where I saw Dad go to work every day.
Yep.
That's what dads do.
It was my football coach.
But if I grew up in a neighborhood and my dad doesn't go to work, or there's neighbor's dad doesn't go to work, I don't know what dads are supposed to do.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to replicate that in a small way with Jumpstart, but that role model is huge.
Yep, good. Anybody else?
I would echo that. I mean, just to say, I think you've seen it on the panel here today. What you need are lighthouses of success that at the family level, at the individual level, and then at the community level. You need to have an example of people succeeding against a lot of barriers that they face, the communities face, the individuals face, helping them succeed in that so it becomes plausible then to other people in the community that there is a way out here. We don't have to accept where we are. Programs like Jumpstart, the programs that we're involved with at ICF, also in Baltimore, are really about trying to create those lighthouses of hope within the community.
Yeah. Well, we can help any way we can. Let us know. I know you will. But the work really happens where you all are. And thank you. Godspeed. I yield back.
And thank you for your service and commitment to community.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Reichert, and thank you to all of our witnesses, our panelists. I really appreciate sharing your insight and expertise and your perspective. It's inspiring to see the difference that you have made in yourselves and your community. I just can't say thank you enough, and look forward to perhaps hearing more in the future, the successes that you've brought about. Please be advised that members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.